Today we're going to be talking about how the South expands and the influence and impact that slavery and society had within the southern and specifically the southeastern part of the United States. Now to begin today, we're going to start off with a big question here that I want you guys to be able to ponder and think about as we go throughout today. It says, how did the creation of a cotton-based economy change the lives of whites and blacks in all regions of the South? So what influence, impact did the cotton-based economy have on the lives of whites and blacks? Now, let's go ahead and start off with the domestic slave trade. Here we have a little chart, graph, that shows from 1790, very few, if any, thousands of bales were being produced. And as it progresses in just before 1860 or so, there's a massive increase, okay? Obviously, with the more bales of things being produced, bales would be like a bale of hay, like the block of hay, or a bale, a unit to measure how much of something that they're growing. With more stuff being grown, they're going to need more workers, and at this time in this location, that's going to translate into more slaves. By 1790, the border with Georgia, and by 1860, the border with Texas. You can kind of see how things were spreading as far as the quantity of slaves, and you're going to see on the next one, the darker the color, so like the reds, have more slaves. So by 1790, slavery was kind of confined to a very small part and in very low percentages. Those purples and those pinks, that's less than 10%. But by 1830, it spread over. 1850, there's 15 states that have slavery. And here it shows that the key to the color coding. Sugar crop in Louisiana was also known as the killer crop for slaves. So right down there where you can see a lot of that red and the orange, that's 30 to 50 and 50% and over of the people there were slaves. Now, you basically have two systems of slavery. You have the inland system, which is exactly what it sounds. It's inland. It was the slave trade system in the interior of the country that fed the slaves to the cotton South. And then you had the coastal system, the domestic slave trade that had roots along the Atlantic coast that sent thousands of slaves to sugar plantations in Louisiana, cotton plantations in the Mississippi Valley. So here you can be able to see the inland versus the coastal system, okay? Inland would obviously be right over here. Sorry. Inland would be right over here. Coastal would obviously be out and around over here, okay? By 1809, Congress outlawed the Atlantic slave trade, so no more slaves coming and going through the Atlantic. But there still was a demand for labor. They needed more workers than what they had. So Virginia started to sell their slaves to the Deep South. 60%, or about 1 million of the slaves, ended up being sold south. Now, obviously, these numbers, these percentages are kind of rough. They don't keep a very good, accurate count of the quantity of slaves. But by the 1850s, a slave could fetch $1,000 cash quickly. It tended to be if they were male, younger, teenage, late teenage, mid to late teenage, and in good physical health. They could catch quite a bit of money to be able to be bought and sold. Now, the idea was something called the chattel principle. It's a system of bondage in which a slave has the legal status of property and so can be bought and sold. Chattel is kind of referencing to the cows and that type of thing. They buy and sell them. Slaves feared being sold to the Deep South because of that sugar crop, the killer crop. A fourth of slave marriages were destroyed. A third of slave children under the age of 14 were separated from one or both of their parents. Think about that. 1 out of 3 slave children under the age of 14 were either separated from at least one, if not both, of their parents. Now, when we often think of slavery, we always think of the physical abuse, the work abuse, those types of things. But there were a handful, wasn't the majority by any means, but there was a handful known as benevolent masters, and they were committed to the welfare of my family, black and white. Didn't matter who was working with them or who was around them, they were committed to them. In Charleston, South Carolina, buying and selling slaves was consistent with moral principles and with the highest order of dignity and civilization. So here in this next image, you can see one of those families being separated. Okay, you can see the little child over there on the left, over there on the right. You can see the mother being separated from her child. Now, here we move on to what it's like for the whites down in the South, okay? You have the dual cultures, you have the planter elite, so there's quite some changes going on. The elite families in Mississippi Valley would have well over 100 slaves. You can see their house or their plantation home down here. The trees overgrown, the big porches, the big pillars, that type of thing. The South had the richest of the rich and also the poorest of the poor. And in that other picture, we can see a slave family there outside their home, outside their dwelling. Looks like we can see, what, 2, 4, 6, 8-ish people or so there. So we can see the rich and the poor. Now, you also had the classical Republican theory, which political tyranny is a threat to liberty. This idea that politics and the overpowering is going to take away their freedom. And it appealed to the wealthy Southerners because they feared their loss of slaves. And they knew if they lost their slaves, their life would not be the same anymore. Aristocratic Southerners wanted the privileged identity to continue through marriage of sons and daughters. So you would have kind of like prearranged marriages, but it was more, or it was to keep in the lines of finances and homes, and they would keep these elites together. Now, Southerners said that slavery was a positive good. They said it's helping these people. In the argument in the 1830s, it subsidized an elegant lifestyle for the white elite and provided tutelage for genetically inferior Africans. That was kind of their thought process. Well, we need these workers to give us this high standard of living, to allow us to have these big fancy homes and all these things, and we're providing tutelage. We're teaching these, and I'm quoting, genetically inferior Africans. So their mentality was that the Africans were inferior. They were not as good, but through the whites, they were able to help them. Now, there were some, and we've talked a little bit about it, there were some that defended slavery, that said, slavery is a religious thing, and so therefore it is okay. Many, religious justification for human bondage. The mentioned Hebrews had slaves. Speaking of the Old Testament, New Testament, Jesus never condemned slavery, and so people kind of use these justifications to make themselves and others feel that it was okay. Now, slaves in the Cotton South, the workers, they much harder and much unremittingly than those in tobacco regions. Here we can see some cotton plantation workers, and they're out there working. And if we look at this graph, it might be a little chart, but between 1790 and 1860, we can see the dramatic increase of the bales of cotton as well as the slaves that were working down there in the South. Now, many slaves would be angry about being sold to the South. They kind of knew what it was like down there. They'd heard stories, and so when they would get down there, they would be mean, they would be stubborn, they would refuse to work and do certain things, and in response to masters would whipping. And here we can see a picture of one of the slaves' backs that has experienced plenty of abuse. Now, you also have planters, smallholding yeomen, and tenants. Those are three other groups. So you have the elite, and then you have some of these others. Most white Southerners, most white people in the South, did not own slaves. And if we look at that pie chart there, we can see it's about 76% of whites in the South did not own slaves. And then we can see that purplish is they owned 1 through 9. The blue is 10 through 99. And the smallest was 0.1%, had well over 100 slaves. There were about 395,000 Southern families that owned slaves in the 1860s. You had the planter elite that had at least 20, if not more. The smallholding planters had 1 through 5. The yeomen, they had a firm hand. They ruled a lot. The males were in charge. Some of them would lose or sell their land, and then they would work on the bigger farms. So kind of think as like a renter. Maybe they had at one time, had a little bit of land at one time and didn't find it financially feasible, and so they sell it and go and work on the other lands. The white landless poor farmers were barely a step above slaves. So they would be treated poorly. Yes, they had their freedom. Yes, they could move around. Yes, they could do many of those things. But as far as many of the upper class in the whites in the South, they were not much of a difference. Here you can see another chart of slavery in the 1860s, percent of slave population by county. Obviously, the darker the color, the dark green, is more than 50%. Now, expanding and governing the South. Now, we have the settlement of Texas. In 1835, there were 27,000 Americans and about 3,000 slaves that were raising cotton and cattle in central Texas. There were also 3,000 Mexican residents. Now, at this time, the modern-day Texas that we know of was controlled by Mexico, but we had a large population of people living there. March 2nd, 1836, the American rebels there, they proclaimed their independence of Texas, and you get this thing called the Battle of Alamo. And in April 1836, they win independence. So there in the background, you can kind of see a drawing of the Battle of Alamo. Now, the United States refused to accept Texas as a state. By them declaring their independence and saying, oh, we're no longer with Mexico, we're with America. Well, America said, not quite, okay? Between 1830 and 1860, Alabama attained about 70% of their taxes from slaves and land. Southerners were more focused on buying land and slaves, not technological innovations. Now, this is going to be a problem because with the advent or invention of technology, you could cut down, you could change the use of slaves, but they were more focused, more slaves, more land, more slaves, more land, instead of saying, what can we do to make the overall process better? And we're going to see later on that there was an invention called the cotton gin. Simple invention. It removed the seeds from the cotton. But by this one invention, how it impacted slavery and different things. Europeans that had settled over in the Americas refused to move south, and so they had a lack of skilled artisans, people in other things besides farming. Now, all of this is going to set up to ultimately why the South lost the Civil War. Okay, the two main reasons that they lost the Civil War is they were all farmers, and they all grew crops. Many of them grew crops that were not edible. You couldn't eat them, and they didn't have factories. They didn't have workers down there. And eventually, during the Civil War, those factories were not able to be used to build weapons and different things. Now, what was it like to be an African American, a black down in the South? Cultural life was kind of a mix of West African ancestors with the South population. Misspelling there, sorry. You had language, laws, and religion. So you have African language, laws, and religions kind of mixing with Americans' laws, languages, and religions. You have a second Great Awakening. Now, we've obviously talked about the first Great Awakening. That's a spiritual awakening, a coming unto spiritual matters. And hundreds of slaves converted to Christianity, a belief in a God and a Jesus Christ. Many slaves, though, still believed in African gods and spirits. And the Protestants, those that were protesting against the Catholic Church, started once there was the protesting of the Catholic Church, many of those preachers would try to convert them to Christianity. You had Black Protestantism. It was a very emotional conversion. It was very ritualistic with their baptism, the communal spirituality. And blacks were treated as children of God, to be treated equally. And this appealed to many Africans down in the South. Now, how would their families and communities come together? Well, they would participate in a lot of dancing and singing and that type of musical component. Languages, even though they'd been away for a while, many of them had learned the language or words within that they would have used back in their previous location. And so they would kind of rely upon those as well. Marriages. Now, a marriage between a man and a woman, slave, male and female slave, was not legally binding. It wasn't legal. And so the way that they would kind of symbolize their marriage is they would jump over a broomstick, hand in hand, jump over this broomstick and be able to designate their love and desire to be with each other and to formalize their marriage. Now, because so many families had been separated and there had been so many deaths, oftentimes
younger people or whoever would choose older slaves and say, can you be my aunt? Can you be my uncle? To be able to build that family relationship, because either they didn't have them or didn't know where they were. Now, um, the idea was to form stable families and communities, but they still had a sense of order in harsh, arbitrary world of slavery. So they wanted some normal things, and that family, a community on a plantation, they would try their best to establish that, despite how rough life was out there. There were two basic types of systems when it came to slavery. You had a task system and you had a gang system. The task system, basically they would say, okay, go out and accomplish this task today. Once you're done with that task, you're more than welcome to come back. You're done for the day. Whereas you had the gang system, you worked together. Everyone worked together until everything for that day was collectively done. The gang system in many regards was much harder. When I think of the gang system, I think of like modern day, I don't know what they're technically called, but sometimes you see them called prison gangs, or the chain gang, where they may be cleaning up along the side of the road and they work until everybody has accomplished that task. The fear of many of the whites was of rebellion. We've talked about some slave revolts in other countries, some minor slave revolts, Nat Turner and different things within America. And so there was this constant fear that the slaves would eventually fight back. Slaves didn't love to work, obviously. They didn't enjoy it, and so they had to be forced to work. There was also things called passive resistance, so like little things that they would do to fight back. Maybe you break a shovel, or you trip over something and you scrape up your knee, and so you're not able to work for a period of time until you heal. Those types of things, little things that would slow the work down and try to still fight back against the system. But it all boiled down to, for the whites, it was, how do we get them to work? Do we give them positive incentives, or do we physically force them to work? Now, there were some that were freed, some Africans that were free, and they either ran away, they flight, or ran away, or they would be granted their freedom by their owner. Half the free blacks in 1840 and 1860s lived in the North. Even though they were free, they were viewed as socially inferior. They were viewed as not being as good. So they got the low-paying jobs. They were farmers or domestic servants in a house. They might bounce from job to job. But many people, them especially, sought for emancipation for all. That word emancipate means to free or separate themselves from something. So once again, we're going to revert back to the big idea. How did the creation of a cotton-based economy change the lives of whites and blacks in all regions of the South? So, we talked about a little bit about the increase in slavery and how it spread from kind of just the East Coast, but all the way over into Texas. We talked about the two different slave trades, the inland and the coastal. We talked about the impact on slaves and what it was like to be a white person down in the South during these times. We talked about how Africans tried to normalize their lives a little bit with creating families and those social structures. So we have all these different things to think about and to ponder as we think about how did the creation of a cotton-based economy change the lives of whites and blacks in all regions of the South.